The morning started just like any other at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The sun was barely peeking through the thick Pacific Northwest clouds, and the usual bustle of early travelers filled Terminal B flight attendant. Ms. Lee adjusted her navy blue scarf in the crew room mirror, going through her pre-flight checklist in her mind. After 15 years in the sky, she had developed an almost sixth sense about flights, and something about this morning felt different. The boarding process for Flight 2317 to Chicago began normally enough. Business travelers typed away on their laptops while waiting at the gate. Families wrestled with carry-on bags, and the occasional tourist snapped photos of the mountain view through the terminal windows. Ms. Lee greeted passengers with her usual warm smile, helping an elderly couple find their seats and assisting a mom traveling alone with her toddler. Then he walked in. The passenger in seat 23C caught her attention immediately. He wasn't particularly tall or short, didn't dress flashy or shabby, just a man in his mid-30s wearing a plain blue button-down shirt and carrying a weathered brown leather bag. But something about his energy felt off. While other passengers were either sleepy-eyed or nose-deep in their phones, this man's eyes darted everywhere, taking in every detail of the cabin with unusual intensity. His hands couldn't seem to stay still. One minute, they were drumming on his armrest, the next fidgeting with his seatbelt, then reorganizing items in his bag for the third time. When the flight attendant offered him water, he jumped slightly, as if startled by her presence, before declining with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. A young software developer sitting next to him in 23B tried making casual conversation about the weather, but the man only responded with short, distracted answers. He kept checking his watch every few minutes, even though the plane's departure time was clearly displayed on the screens throughout the cabin. As the Boeing 737 taxied toward the runway, Ms. Lee noticed him whispering something under his breath. It wasn't unusual for nervous flyers to say a quick prayer during takeoff, but this felt different. His whispers seemed urgent, almost frantic, and he clutched his leather bag like it contained all his worldly possessions. The plane lifted smoothly into the gray Seattle sky, banking east toward Chicago. Most passengers settled into their routines. Some dozed off, others pulled out books or laptops, and the breakfast service began. But 23C remained rigid in his seat, barely touching his coffee, his eyes constantly moving between his watch, his bag, and the emergency exit row ahead. Other crew members noticed too. The lead flight attendant mentioned it during a quick galley chat, and even the off-duty pilot traveling as a passenger raised an eyebrow when passing by on his way to the lavatory. It wasn't anything specific they could point to, just the kind of subtle warning signs that experienced aviation professionals learn to notice over thousands of flights. As the plane reached cruising altitude over the Cascade Mountains, Ms. Lee kept a discreet watch on 23C while going about her duties. Years of experience had taught her that most odd behaviors had perfectly innocent explanations. Fear of flying, personal stress, or just having a bad day. But her instincts, honed over countless flights and interactions with thousands of passengers, told her this was somehow different. The first 2 hours of the 3.5-hour journey to Chicago stretched ahead. Outside, the morning sun painted the clouds in gentle shades of gold and pink. Inside, a subtle tension began building, noticeable only to those trained to read the complex social dynamics of life at 35,000 feet. Nobody could have guessed that this routine domestic flight was about to take a turn that would make headlines across the country and change aviation security forever. 2 hours into the flight, the atmosphere in the cabin had settled into that peculiar kind of quietness that only happens at cruising altitude. Most passengers had fallen into their own rhythms, some watching movies, others catching up on work, a few dozing under thin airline blankets. But the passenger in 23C seemed to be operating on an entirely different frequency from everyone else. It started with a single trip to the lavatory. Nothing unusual about that, except for how tightly he gripped his worn leather bag, knuckles white against the handle. The young software developer in 23B had to awkwardly stand up to let him pass, nearly spilling his laptop in the process. As the passenger made his way down the aisle, Ms. Lee noticed how he kept one hand firmly pressed against the bag, as if afraid it might suddenly disappear. 5 minutes passed, then 10. 15 minutes later, a line had started forming outside the lavatory. A businessman in a wrinkled suit checked his watch impatiently. Just as Ms. Lee was about to knock and check if everything was okay, the door finally opened. The passenger emerged, looking more anxious than before, if that was even possible. He had barely settled back into his seat when he stood up again, mumbling an apology to 23B. This time, Ms. Lee positioned herself near the galley, pretending to organize drinks while keeping an eye on the situation. Through the thin walls of the lavatory, she could hear something that sounded like talking. But it wasn't the usual sound of someone talking to themselves out of habit or stress. These were hushed, urgent conversations, punctuated by long silences. A flight attendant with 30 years of experience once told Ms. Lee that the key to good service was noticing patterns. 3 trips to the lavatory in 45 minutes definitely qualified as a pattern. Each time, that leather bag went with him. Each time, those muffled conversations leaked through the walls. And each time, he returned to his seat looking increasingly agitated. During his 4th trip, something changed. The distinct sound of a phone notification pierced through the lavatory walls. A clear violation of the airline's in-flight regulations. Ms. Lee exchanged glances with her colleague, who nodded in confirmation. They couldn't ignore this anymore. When he emerged this time, Ms. Lee approached him with her most professional smile. "Sir, I need to remind you that using mobile phones during flight is strictly prohibited for safety reasons." His reaction was immediate and unsettling. His face flushed, eyes widening with what looked like panic rather than guilt. "Phone? I wasn't," he stammered, clutching the bag closer. "You don't understand. They're watching. They're always watching." His voice had taken on an edge that made nearby passengers look up from their screens. The software developer in 23B was now fully awake and alert, subtly trying to create more space between himself and his increasingly erratic seatmate. A mother traveling with her children, a few rows ahead, pulled their attention back to their tablets, trying to shield them from the growing tension. When Ms. Lee gently but firmly asked to see his phone, his behavior became even more concerning. "It's not what you think," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "This is bigger than phones, bigger than this flight. If you knew what I knew—" He trailed off, looking around wildly as if expecting someone to jump out from behind the seats. Other passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. An elderly couple held hands tightly, while a college student removed her headphones to better understand what was happening. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from drowsy afternoon routine to something more uncertain. Ms. Lee maintained her calm exterior, but her mind was racing through years of training scenarios. Something was clearly wrong, but what? Was this just anxiety? A medical issue? Or something more serious? The leather bag, which hadn't left his grip since takeoff, suddenly seemed more significant than ever. As the plane continued its journey eastward, crossing over the Montana-Idaho border, no one in the cabin could have predicted how the next hour would unfold, or how this seemingly routine flight would soon become the center of a national security investigation that would change air travel forever. The first sign of real trouble came when the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm, asking all passengers to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Most people complied immediately, except for the man with the leather bag, who now stood rigid in the galley, refusing to move. Ms. Lee had dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about this situation felt different. The man's face was covered in a thin sheen of sweat, his eyes darting between the windows and the emergency exits. His leather bag, which hadn't left his side the entire flight, was clutched so tightly against his chest that his knuckles had turned white. "Sir, she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady and non-threatening. "I need you to return to your seat. It's not safe to stand during turbulence." The plane shuddered slightly, emphasizing her point. But instead of complying, he backed himself further into the corner of the galley. "You don't understand," he whispered, then suddenly raised his voice. "None of you understand. It has to be delivered today. Today. They're everywhere, in every system, every network. I'm the only one who can stop it." Other passengers were now openly staring. A young teacher graded papers a few rows backstopped mid-mark, her red pen hovering over unfinished assignments. An off-duty pilot, who had been sleeping in the last row, was now fully alert, carefully assessing the situation. The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, stronger this time. Drinks rattled in the galley cart. A few passengers gasped, but the man remained standing, as if the normal rules of physics didn't apply to him. His eyes had taken on a wild, almost desperate look. "Sir?" Ms. Lee tried again, maintaining her professional composure while positioning herself between him and the nearest emergency exit. "Whatever's troubling you, we can discuss it once we're safely on the ground. Right now, I need you to." "No." He cut her off, his voice cracking with emotion. "It'll be too late then. They'll have already done it. The whole infrastructure. Everything we rely on." He started pacing in the small space, still clutching his bag. "I found the proof. It's all here. But they're watching. They're always watching." The Lee flight attendant had already made his way to the galley, calmly asking other passengers to remain in their seats. A businessman who had gotten up to use the lavatory quickly retreated, sensing the tension in the air. The entire back section of the plane had fallen silent. That peculiar kind of silence that comes when everyone is trying very hard to appear like they're not listening. Ms. Lee noticed a subtle movement near the front of the plane. Two passengers she hadn't paid much attention to before were now sitting up straighter, exchanging meaningful glances. Their body language had shifted from casual to alert in a way that suggested professional training. The man must have noticed too. His eyes widened even further. "See, they're here. They found me." He began speaking faster, his words tumbling over each other. "The power grids, the water systems, the transportation networks, they've already infiltrated everything. But I have proof. It's all documented. Every line of code, every backdoor, every." The plane shuddered again, and this time he lost his balance slightly, stumbling against the galley cart. His bag swung forward, and for a brief moment, Ms. Lee caught a glimpse of something inside. Papers with official-looking letterheads, and what appeared to be several hard drives. The two alert passengers were now standing, despite the seatbelt sign. They moved with a purpose that made it clear they weren't ordinary travelers. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point, like a rubber band stretched to its limit. What happened next would later be described in dozens of witness statements, security reports, and eventually, congressional testimonies. But in that moment, suspended at 35,000 feet somewhere over America's heartland, no one could have predicted how the next few minutes would unfold, or how they would change the landscape of national security forever. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. The two passengers who had been watching the situation revealed themselves as air marshals, moving with practiced efficiency through the narrow aisle. Their badges caught the cabin light as they approached, and several passengers gasped in recognition. This wasn't just another case of air rage or flight anxiety anymore. "Federal Air Marshal," the first officer announced quietly but firmly. "Sir, please step away from the emergency exit." Their calm professionalism seemed to have the opposite effect on the agitated passenger, who pressed himself further into the corner of the galley, his leather bag still clutched to his chest like a shield. "No, you don't understand," he pleaded, his voice rising with desperation. "I can't let them take it. The evidence, everything I've uncovered." His free hand moved toward the emergency exit handle, causing several nearby passengers to cry out in alarm. The air marshals moved closer, their movements careful and coordinated. Ms. Lee had worked with air marshals before, but usually their presence remained unnoticed throughout the flight. Now, watching them in action, she could see why they were considered the last line of defense in aviation security. "Sir, we're here to help," the second marshal said, her voice steady and reassuring. "But you need to move away from that door." The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and overhead bins creaked ominously. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The passenger made a sudden move, not toward the emergency exit as everyone feared, but toward the bathroom. In his panic, his grip on a leather bag finally slipped. The bag hit the floor with a heavy thud, its contents spilling across the galley floor like secrets refusing to stay hidden. Papers scattered everywhere, some sliding under seats, others floating in the air conditioning current. But it was the other items that made the air marshals exchange sharp glances. Several encrypted hard drives, each marked with official government seals, and documents bearing classification markings that made Ms. Lee quickly avert her eyes. A college student in row 25 had his phone out, but the lead flight attendant quickly and firmly asked him to put it away. This wasn't something for social media. The elderly couple who had been watching everything unfold clutched each other's hands tighter, while a mother in row 24 pulled her young son closer, trying to shield him from the scene. The air marshals acted swiftly, securing both the passenger and the scattered materials. One of them spoke quietly into a hidden radio, using code words that meant nothing to the other passengers but would soon set in motion a chain of events on the ground. In the cockpit, the captain was already in communication with air traffic control. The plane's route displayed on hundreds of passengers' seatback screens showed them tracking north, no longer heading to Chicago. Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport was now their new destination. Ms. Lee helped collect the scattered papers, careful not to read their contents. Some had official letterheads she recognized from the news, others contained complex diagrams and what looked like computer code. One sheet that landed near her feet had a single phrase circled in red: "Critical infrastructure breach." The passenger had stopped struggling now, sitting quietly in a front row seat under the watchful eyes of one marshal while the other secured the evidence. His earlier panic had given way to an eerie calm, but he kept mumbling something about them being in every system, and how no one would believe it until it was too late. The rest of the cabin remained unusually quiet. No one complained about the diverted flight or pulled out phones to check connecting flights. Everyone seemed to understand they were witnessing something significant, even if they didn't know exactly what it was. Looking at the secured hard drives and classified documents, Ms. Lee couldn't help but wonder what secrets they contained. After 15 years in the air, she thought she'd seen everything. But somehow, she knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would soon make headlines across the country and change how people thought about national security in the digital age. The descent into Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport was eerily quiet. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun painted the clouds in shades of orange and pink, a peaceful scene that seemed at odds with the tension inside the aircraft. The captain's voice came over the intercom, professional as ever, explaining that they were making an unscheduled landing due to a security situation. Most passengers were still processing what they'd witnessed. The young software developer who had sat next to the troubled passenger kept glancing at the now empty seat 23C, as if trying to piece together any warning signs he might have missed during their brief interaction at the start of the flight. The mother who had been shielding her son's eyes earlier was now quietly explaining to him why they wouldn't make it to Grandma's house in Chicago on time. "Sometimes," she whispered, "keeping everyone safe means changing our plans." The boy nodded solemnly, somehow sensing the gravity of the situation despite his young age. Through the windows, passengers could see what awaited them on the ground. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, their lights flashing against the darkening sky. But it wasn't just airport police. Several black SUVs with tinted windows had positioned themselves near the terminal, and figures in dark suits stood waiting on the tarmac. Ms. Lee moved through the cabin one last time, ensuring all seats were upright and belts were fastened. The air marshals maintained their vigilant watch over the passenger, who had fallen into a state of exhausted silence. His earlier frenzy had disappeared, replaced by what looked like resignation, or perhaps relief. The landing itself was smooth, a testament to the flight crew's professionalism under pressure. But instead of taxiing to a regular gate, the plane came to a stop on a remote section of the tarmac. The captain's voice returned, calmly asking all passengers to remain seated. Moments later, the cabin door opened. A team of FBI agents boarded efficiently, their movements precise and practiced. The lead agent spoke briefly with the air marshals, while others began documenting the scene, photographing the area where the bag's contents had spilled. The passenger offered no resistance as he was escorted off the plane. As he passed row 23, he paused for just a moment. "I tried to warn them," he said softly, to no one in particular. "I hope they understand in time." Then he was gone, led away by agents who treated him not with the roughness one might expect for a flight risk, but with a kind of cautious respect. The remaining passengers watched through their windows as more agents carefully packed the scattered hard drives and documents into special containers. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything from their rear seats whispered to each other about how this would be a story to tell their grandchildren. A young journalist in row 20 scribbled furiously in her notebook, though she knew the story might be too sensitive to ever publish. The college student who had tried to film earlier sat with his phone in his lap, suddenly understanding why some moments shouldn't be shared on social media. One by one, passengers were allowed to deplane, each being met by FBI agents who took their contact information and preliminary statements. The off-duty pilot, who had been watching everything unfold, was asked to stay behind for a more detailed interview. Ms. Lee stood at the aircraft door, maintaining her professional composure as she bid farewell to each passenger. Many of them made eye contact with her, exchanging looks that acknowledged they had all just been part of something extraordinary. As the last passengers deplaned, the sun had fully set over Minneapolis. The aircraft that had started its journey as a routine domestic flight now sat silently on the tarmac, its cabin still holding the lingering tension of the day's events. Ground crew members approached with flashlights, beginning their search for any remaining evidence. None of the passengers knew it yet, but their diverted flight would soon be connected to one of the largest cybersecurity investigations in recent history. Their unexpected stop in Minneapolis wasn't just a delay in their journey, it was the beginning of a story that would have implications far beyond the world of aviation. In the days following the diverted flight, a complex investigation began to unfold. The FBI's cybersecurity division took over a whole floor of their Minneapolis field office, transforming it into a command center. Computer screens displayed lines of code, network diagrams, and satellite images of infrastructure sites across the country. The passenger, they discovered, wasn't just any IT professional. He had been a senior contractor for one of the nation's top cybersecurity firms, with access to systems protecting power grids, water treatment facilities, and transportation networks. His company had contracts with dozens of government agencies, the kind of connections that opened doors to the country's most sensitive computer systems. The story he told investigators in those first interviews was almost unbelievable. Working late one night, he had discovered unusual patterns in the network traffic. Tiny irregularities that most people would miss, but which pointed to something deeply wrong. Following the digital breadcrumbs, he uncovered a massive breach, not just in one system, but in critical infrastructure across the country. "At first, I thought it was a mistake," he told investigators, his voice steady now, his earlier panic replaced by exhaustion. "But the more I dug, the worse it got. Someone had built backdoors into everything. Power plants, dams, air traffic control systems. They could shut down entire cities with a few keystrokes." The hard drives from his leather bag proved to be a goldmine of evidence. They contained thousands of files documenting the intrusion, screenshots, code samples, network logs. But most disturbing were the emails he had uncovered. Conversations between the hackers and their contacts inside various companies, some dating back several years. Ms. Lee was called in to give her statement 3 days after the flight. Sitting in a small interview room, she described every detail she could remember. The investigators paid special attention to the passenger's behavior, his movements, and particularly his phone calls from the lavatory. Looking back, she told them, it was like he was trying to warn someone, but was afraid of being overheard. The FBI agents exchanged knowing looks at this detail. They had already traced several calls to a private security firm that would soon become central to their investigation. The young software developer who had sat in 23B came forward with additional information. He remembered fragments of conversation from the beginning of the flight. Technical terms that hadn't meant much at the time, but now took on new significance. The off-duty pilot's observation about the passenger's unusual attention to the plane's navigation displays added another piece to the puzzle. As the investigation expanded, more details emerged. The passenger's erratic behavior on the flight hadn't been caused by mental illness or substance use, as some had initially suspected. He had been awake for nearly 3 days straight, racing against time to document everything before what he believed would be an attempt to silence him. His paranoia, it turned out, wasn't paranoia at all. The FBI discovered that a surveillance team had indeed been tracking him. His own company had hired private contractors to monitor him after noticing his late-night access to sensitive systems. What they didn't know was that he had noticed them too, leading to his desperate attempt to get the evidence to federal authorities. The investigation soon spread beyond Minneapolis. FBI teams in other cities began serving search warrants. Computer servers were seized from office buildings. Technical experts worked around the clock, verifying the passengers' claims one by one. With each passing day, the scope of the security breach became clearer and more alarming. In a secure conference room somewhere in Washington, D.C., senior government officials gathered to discuss the implications. The passengers' actions had exposed not just a criminal conspiracy, but a vulnerability in the nation's critical infrastructure that could no longer be ignored. Back in Minneapolis, as Ms. Lee prepared to resume her regular flight duties, she couldn't help but think about the quiet man with the leather bag. His actions, though dramatic, had likely prevented what could have been one of the most significant cyber attacks in history. Sometimes, she realized, the line between paranoia and vigilance was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. 6 months after the diverted flight, the true impact of that day's events began to emerge. The federal courthouse in downtown Minneapolis was packed with journalists and spectators as the first indictments were announced. 12 people faced charges, ranging from corporate executives to IT specialists, spread across 3 different countries. The passenger from Flight 2317 sat quietly in a separate room, watching the proceedings on a closed-circuit TV. He looked different now, rested, composed, wearing a neat suit instead of the rumpled clothes from that day on the plane. The dark circles under his eyes were gone, replaced by a calm determination as he prepared to testify about what he had discovered. Ms. Lee had been called back to Minneapolis to testify as well. Standing before the grand jury, she described every detail of the flight with the same careful attention she brought to her work in the air. Her testimony about the passenger's behavior helped establish the urgency of his actions. How he wasn't just running from something, but racing to prevent a disaster. He kept saying, "They're watching," she told the court. At the time, it seemed like paranoia. Now we know he was right. Several jury members nodded, having already seen evidence of the surveillance teams that had been tracking him. The investigation had uncovered a sprawling network of corporate espionage. Companies that had been trusted to protect critical infrastructure had instead created secret backdoors, selling access to the highest bidders. The potential for havoc was staggering. Power grids could have been shut down, water treatment plants compromised, transportation systems thrown into chaos. The young software developer who had sat in 23B attended one day of the trial. During a break, he spoke with other passengers from the flight who had come to watch. "I keep thinking about how normal everything seemed at first," he said. "Just another guy afraid of flying, you know. Shows how wrong first impressions can be." The elderly couple who had witnessed everything from the back of the plane sent a letter to the courthouse. "We've been flying for 50 years," they wrote, "but we've never been so thankful for airline staff and air marshals being prepared for anything." Their letter was added to the growing pile of testimonials about that day. The mother who had tried to shield her son's eyes during the incident used the experience to teach him an important lesson. "Sometimes the people who seem scary at first are actually trying to help," she explained. "It's not always easy to tell the difference between right and wrong when you're in the middle of it." As the trial progressed, new security measures were already being implemented across the country. Airport protocols were updated to better handle sensitive whistleblower situations. Companies dealing with critical infrastructure faced stricter oversight. Computer systems were being rebuilt with additional safeguards. The passenger received immunity for his cooperation with authorities. His decision to risk everything, his job, his reputation, his freedom, to expose the security breach was recognized as an act of conscience. The leather bag that had caused so much concern on the flight was preserved as evidence, its contents helping to secure convictions that would change the cybersecurity landscape. 1 year after the flight, Ms. Lee received a letter. It was from the passenger, thanking her for her professionalism that day. "I know I scared people," he wrote, "but sometimes the scariest thing is staying quiet when you know something's wrong." She kept the letter in her crew locker as a reminder that not every unusual situation was what it seemed. The story became a case study in aviation security training. Flight crews learned to better distinguish between genuine threats and possible whistleblowers. Air marshals adjusted their protocols for handling sensitive security situations. Even the FBI updated its procedures for receiving sensitive information from industry insiders. But perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't in the new policies or procedures. It was in how people thought about everyday heroes. The passenger who had seemed unstable and dangerous had actually been fighting to protect millions of people he would never meet. His actions reminded everyone that courage sometimes looked different than expected. Back in the air, Ms. Lee often glanced at row 23C when working flights to Chicago. The events of that day had changed how she saw her role in the sky. Every passenger had a story, she realized, and sometimes those stories were bigger than anyone could imagine.